You. Hi, everybody. Welcome. For those of you tuning in, welcome to our panel on Election Day and how to get engaged beyond just voting. This is a really timely conversation with still some state primaries coming up, and of course our general election featuring all the way up to the presidency on the ballot this November. And so I'm Maureen McNerney. I'm our development director for Women's Public Leadership Network. Like most of my colleagues at WPLN, I have some campaign experience as well. And Women's Public Leadership Network, our mission is to educate, organize, and inspire center-right women to enter public office, both elected and appointed office. And of course, along with that, we want to encourage everyone to vote, to get engaged, both with their local candidates, parties, and at the polls. And so hopefully most of us watching have voted. And if you have voted, or if you're going to vote for the first time, there are many different faces that you would encounter as you go to pull your ballot and to cast your vote. And so we're going to explore some of the ways to get engaged. We've got an amazing panel with us, so I'm going to do a quick round of introductions, and then we're going to jump in. So Ellen Rooney is currently one of 2 Republican members of the Election Commission of the City of Boston. And so she is a former executive director of the Beacon Hill Business Association, former executive director of the Access Scholarship Program, former chair of the Boston Licensing Board, and member of the Back Bay Architectural Commission, and a former elected Republican state committee woman as well. Among various other things, she's a great Republican activist prior to her appointed position with the city. Janelle King is a rising star in conservative politics in Georgia, the former deputy state director of the Georgia Republican Party. Definitely instrumental in the governor's race in 2018, and now the co-founder of Speak Georgia, which curates these town hall styled kitchen table talks about hot button issues. She's a consultant for the GOP, a board member for League of Women Voters, Atlanta Young Republicans, and Georgia Young Republicans as well. Dr. Karen Owen is an assistant professor of political science and the director of the Thomas B. Murphy Center for Public Service at the University of West Georgia. She's an expert in gender politics and American institutions. She's now the founder of VoteHer Georgia, which is one of Women's Public Leadership Network's state training partners. And she is an author of a book entitled Women Office Holders and the Role Models Who Pioneered the Way, exploring the influence of female political role models on female state legislators' ambition to run for higher office. She's been recognized for her excellence in teaching. She's a 2020 AEI Leadership Network cohort member, and she's a former lobbyist and health legislative analyst as well. So with that, I want to jump right into the conversation, have everybody sort of sound off about their first impressions as we are heading into Election Day. What are some of the do's and don'ts that you've got for voters and for potential volunteers? So Ellen, we can start with you.
All right. The biggest thing I would say is if you're doing a mail-in ballot, you should do it instantly. Get everything in the mail early. If you have early voting the way we do right now in Boston for this whole week, you can drop it off at our various drop boxes in the early voting sites when they're open, and also at City Hall, and you don't have to go through security, just up to the public entrance. But it's do it right away. And we have a September 1st state primary, so that's coming upon us immediately. But for everybody, because we know you're all going to vote in November, don't wait. I mean, if you're going to do mail-in, get it early, vote it early. You know who you're going to vote for, and you get it off in the mail or in a drop box, however they handle it in your state.
Definitely. Karen, over to you.
So I would second everything Ellen said, especially about have a plan and get out and know exactly what you need to do to vote. So if it is trying to request that absentee ballot, go ahead and figure out what steps you need to do and make sure you understand what the state requires you or the county is requiring of you when you return that absentee ballot. So for instance, some people don't know that they are the ones that have to submit it into the drop box or drop it at the county office, that no one else can do that for you. So just make sure you're aware of those rules as a voter, and then just get excited about voting and want to go vote. I mean, that's the biggest thing I think we could also share. And then I would also say that for any poll official, poll watcher, or campaign volunteer, this is an election that's going to be extremely important, and all eyes and ears are going to be there watching. And so if you're at the precincts, make sure you know the rules and regulations and you're following them and you're being extremely professional in that manner. I think that's key here. You don't want any discrepancies going out.
Definitely. And Janelle?
Yeah, so I echo everything that the other ladies said, and thank you for this opportunity. And I would also say as a don't believe everything you hear on TV, because every state is different and they require different things, and there's a lot of different rules and laws. That's what your county election boards are for, as well as your Secretary of State. So would be to, just do additional research on your own, find out what your county and your state is requiring, but certainly everything else that the other lady said, I think if you do all of those things, you should be in good shape.
And I want to highlight one issue for those folks that are voting absentee or by mail for the first time because of COVID-19. Ellen or Karen, can you jump in and talk a little bit about if you request an absentee ballot and it comes to your home in the mail and you choose not to fill it out, will that cause a problem if you show up to the polls on election day?
Not in Boston, although it will say next to your name, if I assume you're asking, can they just go and vote in person in the polls, even though they got that? Mm-hmm. So when they decide that they're going to go in person, and they go to the check-in table, it will say, Ellen Rooney, and it'll say AV, absentee vote. So the warden will call us in City Hall. We have a team that's taking these calls. They will check in the computer and it'll show that you didn't send it back, you didn't already vote, and you will vote. You can vote. So don't let that deter you if you decide at the last minute that you'd rather go in person.
Great. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And again, for folks to always feel like they can contact officials, both at the party, which we're going to discuss, and at in their governments with any questions around that as well.
Definitely.
So back to you, Ellen, just on poll workers. Obviously, describe what a normal year would look like for poll workers and describe why we need poll workers and why there's such a sense of urgency that more people step up into this role.
Okay, well, normally at this time of year, because we always have a primary, which we have coming up on Tuesday, the state primary, and then we have an election in November. So in Boston, we usually have about 1,600 poll workers because we have 255 precincts. This time, we really figure we need about 1,800 in November, but of course we're in the middle of a pandemic. So a lot of our poll workers, and we've been working all summer, and when I say we have a hardworking staff, currently working 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. and weekends, and recruiting additional poll workers, as our traditional poll workers say they can't because of worrying about COVID, or they may have even had COVID. We're bringing on a lot of new people. There's great interest in November. We find that when we're calling them for our September primary, there's less interest because, of course, they're watching what they see on television, and it's all November. But we're recruiting right now. There are people working tonight recruiting, looking at all the new applications, and that will continue right down to the wire because we're plugging in gaps at the various polls.
And I think it's a question for Janelle and Karen, what is the difference between a primary and a general, just in terms of how voters' attitudes or the type of voter that's voting in these elections?
Okay, I'll go. So the difference between the primary and a general is typically comes down to who's running. If there are a number of Republicans that are running on one side, a number of Democrats running on another side, the primary is to determine who's going to be in the final race, basically. And then in some cases, you know, you don't have a primary, you just kind of skip to the general, and that's what we call like a jungle election, where you have both a bunch of Democrats, a bunch of Republicans, all in one race, and then you know, they just decide who's going to win at the end based on whether or not they receive, you know, either the most votes or enough to get them into a runoff, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But so I think the biggest thing to understand is that, you know, the primary is about getting your candidate or whoever you're supporting to the big race, you know, to the final, and then hopefully they'll push through into the general. But and primaries are extremely important.
So, and I would just follow up and say that remember that the primaries are very specific for the parties. The parties are choosing who they want to represent them in the general election. And usually we see that primaries are voters who are the most activist, the most energized who come out and vote in the primaries. And the general election, it's a little bit different. You have more voters excited because it's a more candidates on the ballot. And so you will see greater turnout in a presidential election. And so I think like Ellen was talking about, we're in a need right now because there's so much interest in the 2020 general presidential and then all the races down ticket. There's interest and enthusiasm, so turnout will be higher. You need additional poll workers. And it's really challenging to find those poll workers. And I was just talking recently to an elections attorney in the state, and he said now is the opportune time to find young people and get them motivated to want to be a poll worker, because one, they understand the changes in technology faster than any group. And a lot of our states are moving towards, you know, different types of voting systems, and they can troubleshoot problems sometimes faster. And they're not the vulnerable population right now. So they should be willing and want to work. So it'll be interesting to see if states are going to start to do a little bit more recruitment for those younger individuals to be poll workers.
Yeah, and I think with so many aspects of this topic, it does vary state by state. So I encourage everybody watching to look up what the rules are in your state. But I was looking, some states, you actually have to be a registered voter in order to be a poll worker. And some states actually lift that for 16 and 17-year-olds if you meet all the other requirements as if you would be registered to vote had you turned 18, that you're now eligible to be a poll worker as well. So I encourage you guys to look into opportunities to help with that as well. In terms of the absentee ballots coming in, we may not have election results on election day, which is a little different. Ellen, can you speak to, is there a need for volunteers after the fact, or in the event of either delayed results because of absentee ballots being counted, or in the event of a recount, as we talk about sort of in any year?
We have till the Friday after the November 3rd election in Massachusetts to get in those absentee ballots or those mail-in ballots that were postmarked by the election. As far as additional people, we are training so many poll workers and will continue to train poll workers for a variety of jobs, including tabulation on election day. So we're all kind of finding our way with this because this is an unusual time, but it goes back to the recruitment and the need, and anyone watching who lives in Boston and the greater Boston area who feels that they want to be engaged, I would encourage you to contact us and go on our website, boston.gov/elections, and apply to be a poll worker. And the younger people, I've got to get that plug in because Janelle had mentioned that, and both of you had mentioned it, I believe. We're recruiting college students as they come back as well.
So now I want to move on to poll watchers, because with all this sort of, all these changes, a lot of people being skeptical of the election for different reasons, and how much of that is justified or not. One institution that we have in all but I believe one state are poll watchers. So Janelle, can you sort of explain the role of political parties in choosing poll watchers, the value both from a party perspective as well as an individual campaign perspective.
Absolutely. So most of the time we hear a lot about poll workers, but poll watchers are what we call the specialized guards to make sure that the election is not being stolen, basically. And so in other words, what poll watchers do is they're responsible for watching the votes coming in. If there is a tabulation process, they watch over that as well. Each of the candidates or political parties or organizations or partisan organizations can select or nominate someone to be a poll watcher. So there should be people represented on both sides of the aisle at all times. And basically their whole job is to make sure that everything is going off correctly, that the rules are being followed, and that there's no opportunity to take advantage of any moments. So I do think it's great that you mentioned poll watchers, because I don't think we talk about them enough. I think it would kind of put a lot of people at ease if we did talk about that portion of the political process. I don't know about every state. I know the counties do not pay poll watchers. I don't know if they're paid by the organization or a candidate or however that works, but they are, I think they're in Georgia. I'm pretty sure they're unpaid here. And then our poll workers are paid through the counties. But yeah, so that's it in a nutshell.
And why do you think it benefits, or if somebody is concerned, why is this a good outlet for them to volunteer and to get involved?
Yeah, so, besides just being a part of the process, right, and actually, attributing to the success of, any outcome, I think it's important to want to be a poll watcher, because you'll get to see the whole process from start to finish, so to speak. And then that will only lead to you being able to educate more people. And then I also think that it's important to have this space too, because like I said, I think it relieves anxiety on a lot of ends, because we kind of go into our own corners, whichever side you're on. And some people are more, passionate about it than others. But regardless of that, I do think that it's important to know that there are people there that represent your interests, and just making sure that the process is as fair as possible.
And Karen, within a primary where there's multiple folks from the same party, can campaigns engage poll watchers either in an official or an unofficial way?
So I know that the candidates and the parties can actually make sure that they have poll watchers, that they have the names, they appoint them to go to precincts. So here in Georgia, and Janelle can correct me here, but I'm pretty sure you get 2 per precinct per party. And then statewide, the party can have about 25, I believe, poll watchers. And then they can go to, different precincts, counties throughout the state, especially when there's statewide races, so that you have that number and there's a guarantee there. And also, Janelle mentioned like the fairness piece, but the best part about, I think, poll watchers is they're there to observe. They can't engage with the voter. And so a poll official, a poll manager, or they can actually talk to the voter to make sure they understand how to cast the ballot correctly. But these are watchers who are observing the process to make sure it's done well, correctly. And that should give us, every voter in America, confidence that our process is done right, and that the results at the end are true results, that we can trust what we're seeing coming out of our precincts, because there are people there monitoring it.
And Ellen, what do you expect from the official side out of folks that are sent to be poll watchers?
We know we'll have poll watchers. Well, we usually have poll watchers. Boston is a very politically active city anyway. We have a lot of advocacy groups, and of course the campaigns themselves will be sending, but particularly for presidential election and particularly for this election. So we always instruct our poll workers to know that the poll watchers, I want to make sure I'm using, the poll watchers are allowed to be there. They have to be within earshot, but they can't, as you said, engage with the voters. But the poll workers, the election officers essentially, who are checking people in, are instructed to say the name of the voter once in a loud, clear voice, once and only once. So if I'm a poll watcher, I can't go, hey, excuse me, I didn't hear that. We can't have that. But we do expect that they will be there. The election officers, the poll workers know that they will be there, and they have to be able to hear, and they're within range.
And I think that's really great for anyone watching this that's going to engage on either side. I think respect being fundamental, and understanding the role that both sides of this play, and being able to share that space, and it'll make everything go smoother. And yes. No need to become the story in all of this, right? Like we're the ones that are making this happen in a good and trustworthy way. So I also want to touch on additional election day activities. So other than going to your polling place, casting your ballot, which of course is, should be everyone's top priority. And if you're not going to be a poll worker or not going to be a poll watcher, the other option is to help out and engage with a campaign, and actually help what we call GOTV, or get out the vote. So Janelle, I'm going to go back to you in terms of what do election day activities look like from the campaign perspective?
Yeah, so when you said GOTV, I got chills because that's where I started. I started in grassroots, and so all we saw was GOTV on everything. But yeah, so the whole get out the vote effort, it doesn't stop on election day. I feel like it kind of ramps up that weekend before and then on that day. Typically, when I worked on campaigns, and I know we worked in the governor's office for the governor's race, we made sure that the week before we had like our Super Saturday, which is where we engage as many volunteers as possible. We send them into every single county, every single neighborhood. And the goal is to make sure that we hit as many last minute voters who are planning to vote on election day. So a lot of people want to wait until election day. I'm not sure what it's going to look like this year. I think at this point, social media and just virtual events and things of that nature, and TV ads has been the key player when it comes to the grassroots because of COVID. But prior to COVID, knocking on doors, doing phone banking, all of that was extremely important. And typically, like I said, the weekend before is where we saw it, we really hit it hard. And then on the day of, we would have people dialing all the way up until 7 p.m. at night when the polls close, encouraging people, if you haven't already, it's not too late. You have 30 minutes to get to the polls. And then we have people that are waving signs on the corner with respect to the distances by law from the actual election site. But, or just even in major areas where we know people will pass in order to get to their polling site. So everything is very, very strategic. It's a well thought out game plan, but I enjoy it. I think it's great. I think this is how you win elections. You win elections on the ground. So, and that's what we did.
And Ellen, I want to kick it back to you, and Janelle touched on it, but that activist on the corner holding the sign, wearing the t-shirt, can they go into the polling place?
When they go into the polls, they can set their sign down 150 feet away from the polling place where they've been standing. If they're wearing a t-shirt, they should put a jacket over it or turn it inside out. They cannot be wearing their campaign buttons. When they go in to vote, I assume that means that they're going in and voting there, because if they don't vote there, they can't even go inside the polling place. But if they go in to vote, they should neutralize themselves, so to speak. And then they vote, and when they come back out, they can flip it all back around, put the button back on, pick up the sign, and start campaigning again, 150 feet away.
And I have to say, always assuming best intentions and making friends on both sides of campaigns, but people generally, at least, definitely in Boston, are respectful of if you lay down your sign on the ground. What they're not respectful of is if you try and stake it in somewhere, or, like try and get that extra inch out of it. Just if you lay it flat, you should be good to go. And I often find that volunteers are ready to hold signs. They're not necessarily ready to make phone calls for the first time on election day.
I'm going to say, remember too, with social distancing, some of these lines may be long. And there are requirements about if you even are at that 150 feet buffer, but the line extends beyond that, you still have to give the voter that additional feet of buffer. So that would be interesting to see play out if there are extremely long lines, you know, how that's enforced, and those volunteers will know that. One other thing about, you mentioned people not wanting to maybe do the phone banking and calls, but now they're doing a lot of this peer-to-peer texting to get out the vote. And so that's a great way for especially young people to encourage others to get out and vote.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
to engage with a campaign, you know, I assume you could go to their social media, their website, and they'd have some way of reaching out. If you say that you're willing to volunteer on election day, I can pretty much guarantee that the person at the other end of that line is going to take you up on it. There's never too many resources on election day to make sure that you're getting out the vote. I want to circle back to all three of these, and we've got a question from the audience on what is the commitment, right? So if you're signing up to be a poll worker, watcher, or volunteer, is that an all or nothing all day, or are you able to schedule certain shifts? And this can be a different answer to every role that you'd be playing. But Ellen, let's start with as a poll worker, what can you expect?
For the poll worker, we expect 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. Some of the people who are applying now, when they hear that, they're just shocked, but it is a 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. shift, and they will be able to take lunch and they'll be able to take breaks. I'll mention that we in Boston, they get a stipend, 160 for inspectors, which is usually the way you'll start out, 175 for clerks, and 200 for wardens, and the warden calls the shots. But that is our structure.
Mm-hmm. Janelle, what do you think for a poll watcher? And I know we've mentioned, and Karen has mentioned as well, sometimes there's one per location per party, sometimes there's two. I've seen a maximum number of people, but is there ever, the ability to step away from that if you're that precinct's poll watcher?
Yeah, so with poll watchers, their hours of operation is kind of very similar to the poll worker. I don't know of any time where they were split up in a lot of shifts because, you want to just make sure you're there, you have eyes at all times. But I believe if there are two, there's a possibility to, kind of swap out. But their hours are typically the same as poll workers. It's pretty much an all day thing.
And then from a volunteer perspective.
Well, sorry, I was going to say, following up on the poll watcher, so the parties and organizations, candidates are looking for those who are extremely committed and they want to do that role. So they're committed to stay there that entire day to observe. As far as volunteering, that can definitely vary. So there are some people who will commit all day and start putting out signs the night before, the morning of the election, stand at intersections all day, working until they can get to the victory party that night, right? That's their hope. And then there are others that can only commit maybe an hour to do some phone calls. And each candidate and party appreciates every moment that someone gives.
Yeah, and I have to echo that any moment that you can give. And if you think about, let's say you've got your 9 to 5 work that day, you're not going to be taking off. I can tell you most people are on that schedule, and there's always that rush in the morning and rush after work. And so giving what time you have is extremely valuable. It's also, though, back to the beginning of our conversation, we're in a unique situation where usually, wanting to volunteer all day on election day is not typically an excuse to vote absentee. And with no excuse absentee being more common, or mail-in voting or early voting periods, like the city of Boston has, where you can walk in anytime, it does allow you to free up your schedule. So definitely something I wish that I had had in the past. And you get that more often for presidential elections and not as often for municipal elections that you'd have an early voting period. So for folks to plan ahead and take advantage of that and free up their day. Also, think about like whether your employer is going to give you the day off. And if you are an employer and you're watching, consider giving your employees the day off to engage on election day.
Yeah, I wanted to add something really quick. Sorry, Maureen. Just to the volunteer and the question about the volunteering, I always want to encourage people to tell the candidate or the campaign where your skills are, right? We would always tell people that, there's a seat for everyone on the bus. And I remember one woman, she came and what she wanted to do was just bring breakfast to the volunteers at the campaign office. And so she would just bring Chick-fil-A. And that was a huge, it gave us a big boost because people would just come in, they would get there earlier because they knew there'd be breakfast there. And so I think just being mindful of what your strengths are and just being able to communicate that will definitely help and make it more of an enjoyable experience.
Definitely. We had another question from the audience, and that's on, with so much worry about election integrity, what's the best way I, as audience member, can help build confidence in our elections with my friends and family? Aside from sharing this conversation where we've unpacked all of the people, all the well-intentioned, dedicated public servants and volunteers that are keeping an eye on it.
Maybe I'll jump in and just give a plug to our hardworking election department staff, because these are people with true integrity who have worked on previous elections for the most part also. Really take it seriously. They know their jobs so well, they worked so hard, and everything, I don't know how else to say that it is so on the up and up. I mean, you can really trust this hardworking election staff.
Definitely. And thank you for everything, Ellen, that you and your team do. I know for the months leading up to and certainly in the weeks after an election.
I'll pass that along. Thank you.
One more question. Oh, we've got a couple now. Is it safe to be at the polls all day long? And, are you getting that feedback either from volunteers or from poll workers?
I could jump in on that one. So, there are a lot of social distancing restrictions that are in place now. I think, we have to be mindful of that even when it comes to the lines and waiting the lines. So if you can vote early or absentee. But I know pretty much, there's still the social distancing restrictions. I know they're sanitizing and wiping down the machines after each person. And because, you vote one at a time, I think that as long as you're following the proper guidelines and restrictions, you should be fine. Wearing your mask and then just making sure that you are, washing your hands and things of that nature. But I think it'll be fine being that, you come in one at a time versus it being like a large group in one small space. But when you're in line, I would say, if you're voting and you're in line, just remember to keep your distance and, keep your mask on and I think it should be fine.
I would also say that I was just going to say in some states, they're really working hard to make sure there is contactless between the poll worker and the voter. So they'll, you'll grab a stylus to even touch a screen and then they wipe those off so that your hands aren't touching. So I think that voters can be reassured that the state and the counties want to take care of their own workers and they also want to protect you. So it should be fine.
Mm-hmm. And we are, with the Boston elections, each poll worker, each precinct gets a package of PPE. It includes the masks, the shields, the face shields, gloves, all the hand sanitizer, hand wipes, and what the two other women have already mentioned. They're wiping down the stations, the voting stations, immediately after the voters have voted, including the markers and pens. The city is also coming through several times a day to sanitize. I had the chance to observe it over early voting this past weekend and saw how it was working. So I think people can be confident in the precautions that are being taken.
Another audience question is, can I bring a friend and what can we do together? in this process.
Oh man, can you bring a friend to volunteer? That's awesome. I think that's like music to our ears. I would say, yeah, absolutely. Bring a friend, bring as many as you can. I found it to be a lot of fun when, I was door knocking and it was like a group of us and, we all were out there sweating and getting our notes and all that stuff. And it kind of makes for a good story because you were a part of history in a lot of ways. So yeah, absolutely. I know I would encourage you to bring as many friends as you would like.
Yeah, and back to your earlier point, Janelle, the weekend before, bring friends, bring family, bring everybody for, if you want to work for a campaign for the days leading up to it as well. So with that, I think that's all the audience questions we have. But I just want to say, this is a great conversation. I want to recap, as a poll worker, what to expect, a long day. Another note that I have is to expect that you'll be trained in being a poll worker ahead of time. So whether that's a virtual or an in-person training, there's typically an application period. Again, every system is a little different. So look, if you're a 16 or 17-year-old interested in helping out, take a look. If you're not a registered voter in that state, take a look if that'll affect your ability to volunteer. But do expect some prep. That's to everybody's benefit that you go through that. And then expect a stipend. So most places do offer a stipend for working on election day. As a poll watcher, expect, to sort of be seen and not heard. Expect folks from another campaign or political party, your counterparts, to be there with you, and expect a long day on that front as well. But you're sort of instilling that much more trust in folks as they go vote. So definitely something to take pride in. I'm glad we got to unpack a little bit more about what they do. And then as a volunteer, expect a very gracious candidate, stories, as Janelle just said, and a lot of shoe leather or dialing or helping out in whatever ways and whatever talents you can bring to the campaigns. But I hope that everybody watching will go vote. Will vote sooner rather than later, and will get involved in some way on election day. So with that, any closing thoughts from you all? We can sort of go in the same order we started in. Ellen, any last parting words?
I would just mention that anyone who thinks their vote doesn't count, in the last municipal race in Boston, we had a recount and an election that was decided by one vote. Now tell me that your vote doesn't count. We plan to see you at the polls on election day. Thank you.
And Karen?
My final, word would be that if you want to trust and have confidence, share your story of voting. You have an experience, and usually it's a great experience when you do cast a ballot. So share it so others have faith and trust and want to go do it as well.
And Janelle?
Yeah. And I would say, again, echoing exactly what the other two ladies said, especially the part about your vote counting. I know we're in the middle of a recount right now in Savannah, and it's down to 20 votes. So, so I would say make sure you go and vote, and try to get there early. Be patient if you do go on election day and lines are long. But to those who are considering to volunteer, believe me, it is so appreciated and so necessary. And I think that's the fastest way to understand the political process.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. Thanks to everybody that tuned in, and we will hopefully see you on our next Facebook Live. Take care.